The first thing Elias Thorne noticed was the heat, not the dry, scorching blast of a stove pushed to its limit, not the thin warmth of a fire barely holding on. This was something else entirely. It was steady, it was gentle, it carried a faint humidity like stepping through an invisible curtain from the dead of winter into the first week of May. He stood in the doorway of Margaret Harlan's cabin, snow-caked in his beard, ice crusting his eyelashes, his heavy canvas coat stiff as sheet metal from the cold. Behind him, the blizzard screamed across the Dakota plains at 50 miles per hour. The temperature outside had fallen past 40 below zero. The wind chill, if anyone had bothered to calculate, it was somewhere near 80 below. The kind of cold that freezes exposed skin in 2 minutes. The kind of cold that kills cattle standing up. And here was this woman standing before him in a wool dress and an apron. An apron. Behind her, through the warm glow of the cabin, Thorne saw the image that would rearrange everything he thought he knew about building, about winter, about survival itself. Two children sat at a small wooden table in the center of the room, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5. They were working on a slate with chalk. They were wearing cotton shirts, not coats, not blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Cotton shirts, the kind you wear on a September afternoon when the breeze comes easy through the window. The cast iron stove in the corner glowed with a small, almost lazy fire. Not the angry red roar of a furnace being fed every 20 minutes. A gentle amber pulse like a heartbeat at rest. Thorne looked at the wall thermometer. He wiped the condensation from the glass with his frozen glove. 62 degrees. Outside, the worst blizzard in the recorded history of the Dakota Territory was tearing the world apart. And inside this cabin, built by a dead miner and maintained by his widow, 2 children, were doing arithmetic in their shirt sleeves. Elias Thorne had been building homes on the frontier for 20 years. He had constructed half the cabins in the county. He knew wood and stone and mortar and nail the way a surgeon knows bone, and he did not understand what he was seeing. Not yet, 6 months earlier. The mule came home alone. It was a Tuesday in late April, 1887. The afternoon light was soft and golden across the high plains, the kind of light that made the grass look like it was breathing. Margaret Harlan was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she saw the animal come around the bend on the main track. She knew the mule's gait the way she knew her own heartbeat. She could tell by the way it walked whether James was in a good mood or a bad one, whether the day at the mine had been long or short, whether he was whistling or thinking. The mule was walking slowly. Its head was low and the saddle was empty. Maggie stood with a wet shirt in her hands and watched the animal come up the track. She did not drop the shirt. She did not cry out. She watched, and in the space of those 60 seconds, she understood what had happened before any man rode up to tell her. James Harlan never let the mule come home without him. Not once in 3 years. James Harlan was 36 years old. He was a mining engineer born in the coal country of western Pennsylvania, raised in the deep shafts of Appalachia, where his father and grandfather had both spent their lives pulling the earth's riches out of the darkness. Jim did not simply know how to dig. He understood the earth the way a sailor understands the sea. He understood how air moved through underground passages, how temperature stabilized at certain depths, how a single miscalculated ventilation shaft could fill a tunnel with poison gas and kill 20 men in silence. He understood pressure load-bearing water flow, and most of all, he understood that the earth was not dead matter. It was a system. It had patterns. It had rules. And if you understood those rules, it would keep you alive. If you did not, it would bury you. He had brought his family west 3 years prior. Maggie, his wife of 9 years. William called Will, their son, 7 years old, with his father's restless curiosity and his habit of asking questions that did not have simple answers. Clara, their daughter, 5 years old, quiet and watchful, with her mother's eyes and her mother's way of seeing everything and saying little. Jim's younger brother, Robert, called Rob, had followed them west a year later with his wife, Dorothy. Rob was 30, a decent man who ran a small freight business, steady but cautious by nature, the kind of man who looked to see which way the wind was blowing before he stepped outside. He and Dorothy had settled on a quarter section 4 miles down the track. They were the only family Maggie had within a day's ride. They had built a solid cabin on a quarter section of high plains grassland. By frontier standards, it was more than respectable. Tightly fitted logs chinked with a mix of mud and dried moss. A good stone fireplace at one end and a new cast iron cook stove at the other. A small mudroom at the front door to break the wind. A barn 60 feet away, sturdy enough to shelter 2 milk cows, a mule, and a flock of a dozen chickens. It was everything a family needed on the northern plains. It was honest work, well done. And then the mule came home alone. The rider from the mine arrived the next morning, a young man barely 20, hat in hand, uncomfortable with the duty he had been given. He spoke carefully the way people speak when they are delivering words that will change someone's life, and they know it. Cave collapse in Section C. The supports had failed. Two young miners were trapped behind a wall of fallen rock and broken timber. Jim Harlan had gone in after them. He had warned the foreman 3 weeks earlier that the bracing in Section C was insufficient, that the timbers were undersized for the load, that the geology of that particular section was unstable. The foreman had listened and nodded and done nothing. The word he used was overcautious. Jim had gone in anyway. He pulled both young miners out alive. He did not make it out himself. The young rider said more words after that, but Maggie had stopped listening after Section C. She knew about Section C. Jim had talked about it at supper. He had sat at the kitchen table and drawn diagrams on wrapping paper, showing her where the stress lines were wrong, where the timber was too thin, where the rock above was fractured in a way that would not hold. He had written it up and given the report to the foreman. The foreman had filed it somewhere and forgotten about it. Jim had come home that evening and opened his notebook, the leather-bound notebook he carried everywhere, the one filled with drawings of ventilation systems and load calculations and air pressure charts from every mine he had ever worked. He turned to the last page and wrote a single line in his careful block letters. Check Section C supports. Told foreman, not safe. That was the last thing James Harlan ever wrote. Maggie thanked the young rider. She closed the door. She sat down in Jim's chair at the table and stayed there until Clara pulled at her hand and asked about lunch. She did not cry, not because she did not feel it. She felt it the way you feel a blade clean and total cutting through everything at once. But there was no time for it. There were two children who needed to eat. There were cows that needed milking at 5 the next morning and every morning after. There were chickens that needed feeding and eggs that needed gathering and clothes that needed washing and mending and a garden that needed planting because summer was coming and the canned goods from last year were running low. Grief was a luxury she could not afford, so she packed it into a tight, hard knot somewhere behind her ribs and she kept moving. For weeks she had operated like a machine. Up before dawn, milk the cows, feed the chickens, gather the eggs, boil water, make breakfast, clean the cabin, wash clothes, mend what was torn, work the garden, cook supper, put the children to bed. Every day the same. Every task completed with the mechanical precision of a woman who knew that if she stopped moving, even for an hour, the weight of what she had lost would crush her flat. Then in the silence of the evenings, after Will and Clara were asleep, she would sit at Jim's table and open his notebook. She did not understand all of it. The engineering calculations, the mathematical formulas, the load-bearing equations, these were a language she had never formally studied. But the handwriting was Jim's. The careful block letters, the precise lines drawn with a carpenter's pencil, the small notes scribbled in the margins in moments of insight or frustration. Reading the notebook was the closest thing she had to hearing his voice. Jim had always talked to her about his work. Not because she asked, though she sometimes did, but because he needed someone to think out loud with, and she was the only person who truly listened. She listened the way the earth absorbs rain quietly and completely, and what went in did not come back out. It stayed. It settled into the layers of her mind and became part of the structure. Over 3 years of marriage on the plains and the years before that in Pennsylvania, Jim had explained to her how air moved in underground passages, how temperature stabilized below the frost line, how ventilation could save lives or end them, how the earth at depth maintained a steady warmth that had nothing to do with the seasons above. He explained these things not as lessons but as conversations, the ongoing dialogue of a man who loved his work and loved his wife and saw no reason to keep the two separate. Maggie had absorbed all of it. She did not know she had absorbed it. Not yet. One evening in early May, she found a folded piece of wrapping paper tucked into the back pocket of Jim's work coat, the coat still hanging on the peg by the door where he had left it on his last morning. She unfolded it and recognized the drawing immediately. A ventilation diagram. He had sketched it at the breakfast table one morning, roughly 2 weeks before the accident. Will had climbed up on the chair beside him and pointed at the lines and circles. "What is that, Pop?" "That is a ventilation shaft, son." "What does it do?" "It moves air underground. See, down in the mines, the deeper you go, the warmer it gets. Winter never reaches 100 feet down. The earth keeps its own heat, Will. Not much, but it is steady. it never quits. He had tapped the drawing with his pencil. Below the frost line, about 4 or 5 feet down here in Dakota, the ground stays between 45 and 55 degrees all year round. Does not matter if it is 100 above or 50 below up here on the surface. The earth holds the memory of summer. Then he had folded the paper and tucked it into his coat pocket with a shrug. Just an idea. Not practical, above ground. Not practical. He had dismissed it, discarded the thought the way you discard a hand of cards that does not quite work. Maggie held the folded paper under the lamplight and looked at it for a long time. She did not fully understand what she was looking at. Not yet, but she placed it between the pages of his notebook and closed the cover. She kept it. Summer passed. The children grew brown from the sun. The cows gave good milk. The garden produced squash and beans and potatoes and enough tomatoes to fill 24 canning jars. The days were long and bright and full of the kind of physical work that keeps grief at a manageable distance. Maggie did not allow herself to think about winter. She kept her head down and her hands busy, and she got through the days one at a time. But the earth has its own calendar, and it does not care about human schedules. By late September, the days were shorter, the nights were longer, and the air had acquired the clean, sharp edge that every plainsman recognizes as winter sharpening its knife. And then the arithmetic became unavoidable. 4 cords of firewood. James had cut it the previous autumn, split it clean, and stacked it in a long, neat row beside the barn. Good seasoned oak, dry as bone, ready to burn. 4 cords. It was all she had. She could not leave the children alone to go logging. She could not hire a man to cut wood because she could not afford it. The savings Jim had left were already more than half gone, consumed by the summer's expenses, the seed for the garden, the feed for the livestock, the small purchases at the trading post that kept a household running. 4 cords of wood to survive a Dakota winter. Anyone who had spent a single season on the northern plains knew exactly what that number meant. A well-built cabin with a good stove consumed between 5 and 7 cords in an average winter. In a hard winter, 8 or 9. The Colby Ranch, with its large main house and its wealthy owner, went through 12. 4 cords was not enough. It was not even close to enough. It was the difference between barely surviving and not surviving at all. She sat with that number every evening, turning it over, examining it from every angle, the way Jim would have examined a problem with a mine structure. 4 cords, roughly 96 million BTUs of potential energy. But a cabin like hers, with its gaps and cracks and single-pane windows and 2 exterior doors, leaked heat into the Dakota sky at a rate that turned those 96 million BTUs into a trickle against a flood. She would run out by January, maybe sooner if the winter came hard. And when the wood was gone, the arithmetic was simple and final. The stove goes cold, the cabin freezes. Everything after that is a matter of hours. One evening in the last week of September, Maggie sat by the stove mending a pair of Will's trousers. The stove was already lit against the night chill, not because the cold was dangerous yet, but because the nights had teeth now, and the children needed warmth to sleep. Will sat across the room near the far wall, reading a book by the thin yellow light of a candle. Clara was already asleep in the loft. Maggie looked up from her needle and saw it. Will's breath, a small white plume rising from his mouth with each exhale drifting upward, dissolving in the lamplight. The boy was breathing fog inside his own house. The stove was burning, the door was closed, the window was shut, and her son's breath was visible. She watched that small cloud of vapor for a long time, and in it, she saw the truth she had been avoiding for months. They were not living in a shelter. They were living in a sieve. Heat poured out of this cabin through every gap in the logs, every crack around the window frames, every whisper of space between the door and the jamb. The wind did not need to break down the walls. It found the seams. It pressed its fingers into every imperfection. And the stove, that iron machine with its insatiable appetite, was not warming a house. It was trying to warm the entire sky shovelful by shovelful and losing ground with every gust. She remembered the winter before the winter of 1886 when Jim was still alive. An average winter, the neighbors had called it. Average by Dakota standards meant 3 months of temperatures that rarely climbed above 0. It meant wind that blew at 20 miles per hour for weeks without stopping, a physical presence that clawed at the walls like something alive. Jim had burned 7 cords that winter. 7 cords for a cabin this size. And still the cabin had never truly felt warm. Near the stove, it was 60 degrees. 3 feet away, it was 50. In the corners, it was near freezing. The floor was a permanent sheet of ice. A cord of dry oak holds roughly 24 million BTUs of energy. They had burned 7 cords, 168 million BTUs. And the cabin had felt like a cold storage room with a campfire in the middle of it. She lay awake that night listening to the wind. It had a voice here. Not a howl exactly, but a long, searching moan that tested every wall, every joint, every corner, probing for weakness, the way water probes for cracks in stone. And in the darkness, with the wind pressing against the cabin like a living thing, Jim's voice came back to her as clear as if he were lying beside her. The earth has its own heat, Maggie. Not much, but it is steady. It never quits. She sat up, lit the lamp. The small flame threw long shadows across the room. She opened Jim's notebook and found the folded paper. She laid them side by side on the table and looked at them for a long time. The ventilation diagram, the arrows showing airflow, the notes about temperature underground. The number that mattered most, the one Jim had spoken out loud at the breakfast table, while Will watched below the frost line, 4 to 5 feet down in Dakota. The Earth maintains a constant temperature between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, all year, every year, regardless of what happens on the surface. She looked through the window at the dark shape of the barn 60 feet away. 2 milk cows in there, a mule, a dozen chickens, living creatures producing heat with every breath, every heartbeat, every slow process of digestion. The inside of that barn, even in the depths of winter, would be 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside air heated by nothing more than animal bodies. The idea did not arrive like lightning. It came the way water comes through stone, slow, certain, unstoppable. If she dug a trench, 5 feet deep, 60 feet long, from the cabin to the barn, covered it with timber and iron and 2 feet of packed earth, sealed it at both ends with insulated doors, installed a ventilation intake at the barn end. She would have 3 things at once: a sheltered passage to the livestock, so she would never need to open the cabin door to the killing wind. Never lose heat to the outside air on those twice-daily trips to milk the cows and feed the animals. A tunnel whose walls and floor were in permanent contact with earth below the frost line. Earth that stayed between 45 and 55 degrees no matter what the sky was doing. 60 feet of underground passage acting as a massive passive heat exchanger, warming any air that passed through it to nearly 50 degrees before it reached the cabin. And a conduit for the warm air inside the barn, heated by the body heat of the animals to be drawn through the tunnel by the natural convection current created by the temperature differential between the barn and the cabin. Her stove would not need to fight to raise minus 40 degree air to 60. It would only need to lift 50 degree air to 60, a difference of 10 degrees instead of 100. The thought was so simple that it frightened her. If it was this obvious, why had nobody done it? Why had Jim himself dismissed it as not practical? What was she missing? She stared at the diagram. She stared at the numbers. She stared at the dark window in the shape of the barn beyond it. She did not sleep. By morning, she had made her decision. The auction notice appeared at the trading post in early October. Army surplus sale at Fort Meade. Used corrugated iron sheeting, rough-sawn timbers, miscellaneous hardware. Maggie hitched the mule to the wagon, left the children with Dorothy and Rob for the day, and made the journey. She was the only woman at the auction. She stood among weathered men in heavy coats, silent, small, her face composed and unreadable. When the lot of iron sheeting and surplus timber came up, she raised her hand and kept it raised until the auctioneer pointed at her and called the price. $60, more than half of her remaining savings. Roughly $1,800 in the money of a later century. Every cent she could not afford to lose. She loaded the materials onto the wagon by herself. The iron sheets were heavy and awkward, and 2 men watched her struggle with them for a full minute before one of them walked over and helped without a word. She thanked him and climbed onto the wagon seat and drove away. On the road home, in the middle of an empty stretch of grassland, where the track was nothing more than 2 wheel ruts in the autumn brown grass, she stopped the mule. She sat on the wagon seat and did not move. Her hands held the reins but did not pull. The mule turned its head and looked at her with the patient and curious expression of an animal that has no opinions about human decisions. She had just bet everything she had on a folded piece of wrapping paper, a sketch drawn at a breakfast table by a man who was now dead. An idea that man himself had dismissed. She sat there for a long time. Then she picked up the reins and drove home. The digging began the next morning. The trench would be 4 feet wide, 5 feet deep, and 60 feet long. She calculated the volume in her head the way Jim had taught her to estimate material quantities. Roughly 44 cubic yards of earth, close to 50 tons. She had a pickaxe that had belonged to Jim, heavy-headed and long-handled, a shovel and a wheelbarrow with an iron wheel. The first foot was soft, dark prairie topsoil, richy and crumbling, full of grass roots and the tiny tunnels of insects and worms. The shovel slid in easily. The earth came up in clean bites. Below that, everything changed. Dense gray clay studded with rocks packed hard by 10,000 years of accumulated weight. Every stroke of the pickaxe sent a shock through her forearms and into her shoulders and up into the base of her skull. The clay did not crumble. It had to be cut, chipped, pried loose in chunks that weighed as much as bricks. She dug 3 to 4 feet of length per day. 60 feet divided by 3.5 meant roughly 17 to 20 days of continuous labor. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed roughly 120 pounds. The pickaxe weighed close to 8. She swung it hundreds of times a day, each swing requiring her to lift the tool above her head and bring it down with enough force to break clay that had not been disturbed since the glaciers retreated. By the 3rd day, her hands were blistered. By the 5th day, the blisters had torn open and the raw skin underneath had begun to callous. By the 10th day, her hands had become something new, hard and rough and permanently curved from gripping the handles. She did not wrap them or treat them. She did not have time. Will became her only companion in the work. At 7, he was too small to swing the pickaxe or push the loaded wheelbarrow. But he could carry water from the well. He could watch Clara while Maggie dug. He could bring her a ladle of water when she paused to catch her breath. And he could ask questions, which he did relentlessly, with the same bottomless curiosity that had been his father's defining characteristic. "What are you digging, Ma?" "A passage to the barn." "Why?" "So we do not have to go outside in the winter to tend the animals." "Why does it have to be so deep?" "Because the cold only goes down about 4 feet. Below that, the ground stays warm all year round." "How warm?" "About 45 to 55 degrees. Your father told me that." Will was quiet for a long moment, processing. He had his father's habit of chewing on information before speaking again, turning it over in his mind the way you turn over a stone to see what lives underneath. Did Pa know this would work? Maggie stopped digging. She rested the pickaxe against the wall of the trench and looked at her son. He was standing at the edge, looking down at her with an expression that was so much like Jim's that for a moment the hard knot behind her ribs threatened to come undone. "Your father knew the principle was sound," she said carefully, "but he thought it was not practical." Will considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old philosopher. "So what do you think?" Maggie looked at the half-finished trench, at the pile of excavated earth beside it, at the barn 60 feet away and the cabin 60 feet behind her, at the 4 cords of wood stacked neatly by the barn wall, the only fuel she had, the only thing standing between her family and the cold mathematics of a Dakota winter. "I think we do not have another choice, son." She laid a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel along the entire bottom of the trench. This was the detail that no one could see from the surface, but that made everything else work. The gravel served as a drainage bed, a channel for any water that might collect in the tunnel, directing it away from standing pools and toward the earth where it could disperse. Over the gravel, she built the floor with a slight grade so subtle it was nearly impossible to detect with the naked eye, sloping gently from the cabin end down toward the barn foundation. Any moisture that entered the tunnel would flow by gravity away from the house. She framed the trench with the surplus timbers, creating a sturdy A-shaped structure inside the ditch. Over this framework, she laid the corrugated iron sheets, overlapping them carefully the way you overlap shingles on a roof, so that water would run across the surface without finding a way through. Then she shoveled the excavated earth back on top of the iron sheets, packing it down firmly layer by layer until the covering was 2 feet thick. A long earthen mound took shape, snaking across her yard from the cabin to the barn like some ancient burial ridge raised by a forgotten people. She built insulated doors at both ends. One opened into the cabin's small mudroom, connecting the house to the tunnel without any exposure to the outside. The other opened into the warmest corner of the barn, near the cow stalls where the animal heat was concentrated. At the barn end, she installed a small, baffled intake pipe that would draw air from inside the barn itself, air already warmed to 30 or 35 degrees by the body heat of 2 cows, a mule, and a dozen chickens. This pre-warmed air would be pulled through 60 feet of underground passage, surrounded by earth at 45 to 50 degrees. By the time it reached the cabin, simple thermodynamics would have raised its temperature to somewhere near 50 degrees regardless of the conditions above ground. The air gap between the timber frame and the earth walls was crucial. Still air insulates. Moving air strips heat. Her tunnel was designed around that fundamental law. The passage was a heat exchanger, a radiator in reverse, using the Earth's steady warmth to precondition the air before it reached the cabin. Her stove would not be fighting against Arctic cold. It would be gently raising air that was already warm. From the outside, the finished structure looked bizarre. A long grass-covered mound connecting two small buildings like a levee or an ancient earthwork, or as the neighbors would soon begin to say, a grave. The total cost was under $100, $60 for the surplus materials from Fort Meade, $20 for additional hardware and lumber from the trading post, a few dollars for the gravel hauled by wagon from a creek bed 2 miles east. When she was finished, she stood in the yard and looked at what she had built. It was late October. The first frost had come and gone. The grass on the mound was already brown and dry. The wind was picking up out of the northwest, carrying the smell of winter. The neighbors had been watching. Elias Thorne was the first to confront her directly. Thorne was 52 years old, the owner of the sawmill, the master carpenter who had built half the cabins in the county. He was a tall, heavy-shouldered man with hands the size of dinner plates and a voice that carried across any room he entered. He had been building on the frontier for 20 years, and his professional identity was inseparable from the traditional methods he had mastered. He built with logs and stone and mortar. He built above ground, elevated off the earth to avoid damp and rot. He built thick walls and tight joints and good chimneys. He knew the right way to do things because he had been doing them the right way for 2 decades. He stopped his wagon one afternoon and climbed down. He walked to where Maggie was banking the last of the soil against the tunnel entrance, patting it firm with the flat of the shovel. He took off his hat, a gesture that looked like respect but felt like a preamble. "Mrs. Harlan," he said, his voice deep and certain, "I do not mean to pry, but I have been building in this territory for 20 years. I know the soil, I know the melt." He pointed at the mound with his hat. "Come spring, when the thaw hits, all the snow on that mound is going to melt and run right down the sides. It will saturate the ground. That trench of yours is going to fill with water like a bucket. It will flood your foundation and rot the sills of your cabin clean through. You are building a mud trap, ma'am, a cistern." His objection was technical. It sounded reasonable. It was based on decades of hard-won experience. And it was wrong because it was based on what he could see, and the things that made Maggie's design work were the things he could not see. The gravel, the grade, the drainage. He looked at the surface and judged the structure the way you judge a book by its cover, and the cover of this particular book looked like madness. Maggie thought about explaining. She thought about describing the gravel bed, the calculated slope, the way moisture would be channeled away from the cabin by the simple, irresistible logic of gravity. She decided against it. Arguing with a man like Elias Thorne was like arguing with a stone wall. The wall would not move, and you would only exhaust yourself pushing. "I have made arrangements for the water, Mr. Thorne," she said. He put his hat back on, slowly, deliberately. He shook his head. "There is the right way, and there is the wrong way. I hope for your children's sake this is not the wrong one." He climbed back onto his wagon and drove away. The authority on building had delivered his verdict. The verdict traveled. At the general store in town, the mockery began in earnest. Grady Polk, a loud ranch hand with more mouth than brains, spotted Rob Harlan coming through the door and called across the room loud enough for every man by the stove to hear. "Hey, Rob, I saw your sister-in-law's project out there. Looks like she is digging her own grave. Smart, I guess. Saves everyone the trouble come January." The men laughed. Rob's face went dark red. He bought his supplies and walked out without a word. The nickname stuck like tar. The Grave House. Calvin Jessup, the county extension agent, arrived a few days later. Jessup was 45, a man of books and government bulletins, a proponent of scientific agriculture and modern homesteading methods. He carried a leather portfolio filled with pamphlets from the Department of Agriculture. He walked around the mound, tapped it with his boot, and delivered his assessment with the confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem that could not be solved by consulting the correct publication. "Mrs. Harlan, I will be frank. I have received expressions of concern from your neighbors. This construction is highly irregular. It does not appear in any manual I have seen from the Department of Agriculture. A sunken structure of this nature invites dampness, mold, and frost heave. It is structurally unsound and potentially unhealthy for habitation. Maggie stood in her doorway. She did not invite him in. She did not argue his points. She let him finish, then issued a quiet challenge that caught him off balance. Come back in January, Mr. Jessup. Bring your calibrated thermometer. We can see then what is unhealthy. He was startled by her confidence. He tipped his hat, promised he would return, and drove away, making careful notes in his logbook about the irregular construction and the stubborn widow who refused guidance. Pastor Willard came next, a lean, kind-faced man in his 60s who had led the valley's small congregation for 15 years. His visit was gentle in tone but carried the heaviest thread of all. He spoke about concern, about the welfare of the children, about the importance of stability, about how perhaps Robert and Dorothy could provide a more structured environment for William and Clara. Temporarily, of course. Temporarily. Maggie heard the word and understood exactly what it meant. It meant the county could take her children. It meant that if enough people decided she was unfit, if enough respected voices spoke up about the crazy widow and her grave house, she could lose Will and Clara. Not to the cold, not to hunger, to the opinion of men who had never dug a ditch or calculated a BTU in their lives. She looked at the pastor without blinking. My children are warm-fed and schooled, Pastor. I invite you to return in January to verify that for yourself. The deepest cut came from family. Rob Harlan drove out to the cabin in late October, his face lined with worry, trapped between his genuine concern for his brother's wife and his fear of what the community was saying about her. About him for allowing it. Maggie, he said, standing in the yard, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the mound, refusing to look directly at it. This has gone too far. It is not just gossip anymore. People think you are either frightened or incompetent. Maybe both. They are talking about involving the county, about the children. The threat hung in the cold air between them. Maggie looked at the man her husband had loved. She kept her voice level, not a trace of anger, not a trace of self-pity. I am not trying to impress anyone, Rob. I am trying to keep my family warm. Rob left. He drove his wagon back down the track without looking back. He was a good man caught in the current of public opinion, and he did not have the strength to swim against it. He knew Maggie was not crazy. He knew she was the most practical person he had ever met. But knowing that and saying it out loud in front of Grady Polk and Elias Thorne and Calvin Jessup and the entire congregation of Pastor Willard's church were two very different things. And the distance between them was a measure of Rob Harlan's character. In that moment, a measure he was not proud of. Late November. The tunnel was complete. The first hard freeze had locked the ground solid, sealing the earthen mound in a casing of frost. From the outside, it looked like a long, low ridge of frozen earth connecting the cabin to the barn, already dusted with the season's first thin snow. Strange, solitary, defiant. Maggie stood in the yard at dusk and looked at it. The wind was rising steady out of the northwest, carrying the smell of open ice and empty sky. The kind of wind that tells you what is coming, even if you do not want to hear it. And for the first time in the failing light of a November evening, she allowed herself to think the thought she had been pressing down for 2 months. What if Jim was wrong? What if the earth did not hold heat the way he believed? What if the temperature below the frost line was not as stable as his mining experience suggested? What if the drainage failed and Thorne was right about the water? What if she had spent her last savings and her last strength on the memory of a dead man's voice, an idea that he himself had called impractical? She looked through the cabin window. Will was reading to Clara by candlelight. Their shadows moved on the wall, small and warm and alive. Maggie drew a long breath. The cold air cut into her lungs like a blade. She held it, let it burn. Then she released it in a long white plume that the wind tore away instantly. She went inside. She closed the door. She sat down next to her children, and she waited. Winter was coming, and she had staked everything, the money, the wood, her reputation, her right to keep her own children on a folded piece of wrapping paper, and the memory of a voice that said the earth has its own heat. Not much, but steady. It never quits. She was about to find out if that was true. What she did not know, sitting in that warm circle of lamplight with her children, was that she had already begun to change the valley. Not by persuasion, not by argument, but by the simple, stubborn, irrefutable act of building something that worked. The evidence was buried in the ground, 60 feet of it, invisible to every eye that looked from above waiting for the cold to come and prove what the earth had always known. The tunnel sat beneath the frozen yard, sealed and silent, its timber frame holding the weight of 2 feet of packed earth in the first thin layer of November snow. Inside, the temperature was already 48 degrees. The gravel bed was dry. The air was still and clean. The slight grate of the floor was doing its invisible work, directing any trace of moisture away from the cabin foundation and toward the lower end at the barn. If anyone had crawled through it that night, they would have felt the strangest sensation. The world above was freezing. The stars were hard and bright, and the wind was a blade. But 5 feet below the surface, inside this rough, unglamorous passage of timber and tin and packed earth, the temperature was warmer than a root cellar and steadier than any stove. The walls did not fluctuate. They did not respond to gusts or to calm. They held their warmth the way bedrock holds its position. Immovable, uninterested in the drama above. From the barn end came the faint sound of animals breathing, the slow, wet rhythm of cows at rest, the occasional shuffle of the mule adjusting its weight, the soft rustle of chickens settling on their roost. These were the sounds of living creatures doing what living creatures do, converting feed into body heat, breath by breath, hour by hour, pumping warmth into the barn air the way a heart pumps blood. That warmth was not escaping into the frozen sky. It was being drawn into the tunnel, pulled gently through 60 feet of earth-warmed passage, arriving at the cabin end, already tempered by the ground to nearly 50 degrees. The system required no attention, no stoking, no feeding, no monitoring. It ran on the oldest fuel in the world, the heat of the earth and the breath of animals, and it would run as long as the earth was warm and the animals were alive, which was to say it would run forever, or close enough to forever that the difference did not matter. Above ground, the wind picked up. November was ending. December was sharpening its teeth behind the horizon. Across the valley, families stacked their last loads of firewood and checked their chimneys and stuffed rags into the cracks they could reach and prayed about the ones they could not. They prepared for war the only way they knew how. More fuel, more fire, more desperation. Maggie had prepared differently. She had gone under the battlefield, and now she waited. December came to the Dakota Territory the way a man comes to collect a debt. Not with fury at first, but with patience, with certainty, with the absolute knowledge that what was owed would be paid in full. The cold did not arrive as a storm. It arrived as an occupation. A massive dome of Arctic air slid down from the Canadian interior like a slow-moving glacier of atmosphere, settled over the northern plains and refused to leave. It pressed down on the land the way a hand presses down on a chest, steady, immovable, without mercy and without end. The escalation was mathematical. On December 8th, the thermometer at the trading post registered 8 below zero overnight. Farmers nodded and pulled their coats tighter and said that winter had arrived. 4 days later, on December 12th, the mercury fell to 31 below. Conversations at the trading post grew shorter. Faces grew tighter. On December 18th, the temperature dropped to 38 below zero, and a wind began to blow out of the northwest. Not gusting, not intermittent, a steady, keening, relentless 30-mile-per-hour gale that did not pause and did not weaken and did not stop for 23 consecutive days. For 352 straight hours, the thermometer at the trading post never climbed above zero. Let that number settle for a moment. 23 days, not a single hour above zero. And the wind, that constant searching 30-mile-per-hour wind, pushing the effective temperature on every exposed surface down past 60 below. Wind does not simply make cold air feel colder. That is a polite simplification for people who have never had to survive it. Wind strips heat directly from surfaces. It reaches into every crack in every wall, every gap around every window frame, every imperfect seal around every door, and it pulls warmth out the way a pump pulls water. A cabin in still air at 0 degrees loses heat at a certain rate. The same cabin in a 30-mile wind at 0 degrees loses heat 3 times as fast. The wind is not an inconvenience. It is a weapon. The snow that fell during those weeks was not the soft white blanket of Christmas illustrations. It fell as fine, hard crystals, tiny as grains of sand, driven almost horizontally by the gale. It did not float down from the sky. It flew sideways, scouring exposed skin, packing into every gap and crevice it could find. It did not cover the landscape. It reshaped it. Drifts piled against the north walls of buildings until they reached the eaves and then kept growing, burying windows, blocking doors, entombing entire structures in hard, packed white. Roads disappeared beneath the drifts, fence lines vanished, the horizon vanished. The world shrank to the dimensions of your house, and inside that house, a war of attrition was being fought every hour of every day. And every family in the valley was losing. The Colby Ranch was the wealthiest operation within 30 miles. They had resources that most homesteaders could only dream of. A large, well-constructed main house, a full woodshed stacked with expensive seasoned hardwood purchased from Thorne's mill. They had money and manpower and every advantage the frontier could offer. They burned through 2 full cords of wood every month, feeding their iron furnace around the clock, a man assigned to the task in rotating shifts, so the fire never flagged. And the best they could hold was 42 degrees in the main room. 42. The ranch hands in the bunkhouse woke each morning to an inch of solid ice on their water buckets. They slept in their boots and coats and hats and still woke shivering. Still woke with their joints stiff and their breath frozen on their blankets. Elias Thorne discovered that his own house, the finest home in the county, the 2-story masterwork he had built with his own hands as a monument to 20 years of craft, was hemorrhaging heat. The wind found microscopic gaps in his window frames and door jambs, gaps so small they were invisible to the naked eye, but large enough for the cold to exploit. These were gaps he had never known existed because they only revealed themselves at temperatures his experience had never encountered. He burned 2.5 cords per month. His family abandoned the upstairs bedrooms entirely, dragging their mattresses down to the main room and sleeping on the floor in a small circle around the stove. The kitchen was too cold to use for more than a few minutes at a time. The pantry froze solid. The water bucket by the back door became a block of ice that had to be thawed each morning with boiling water. The man who had built more homes than anyone in the territory could not keep his own family warm. The man who had told Maggie Harlan she was building a mud trap was feeding his furnace like a man shoveling coal into a sinking ship. Across the valley, the suffering was specific and measurable. The Williams family, a quarter-mile down the track, burned 1.8 cords per month and held 48 degrees. They wrapped their children in every blanket in the house and considered themselves fortunate. The Miller family had cut their wood late in the season, and much of it was still green heavy with trapped moisture. Green wood is a traitor. It looks like fuel. It burns like a lie. Every pound of water locked in a green log requires over 1,000 BTUs of energy just to convert to steam before the wood itself can catch and produce useful heat. The Millers were spending half their fuel simply drying it. Their stove hissed and buttered and smoked, produced more frustration than warmth, filling the cabin with a thick haze that burned their eyes and coated the chimney with creosote, that dark tarry residue of incomplete combustion. On the night of December 22nd, the creosote in the Miller chimney caught fire. The family woke to a roaring sound and an orange glow coming from the stovepipe. They smothered the chimney fire with snow shoveled through the window. It saved the cabin from burning, but it killed the fire in the stove. No fire meant no heat. No heat at 30 below meant death measured in hours. The family, 2 adults and 3 children, wrapped themselves in everything they owned and stumbled through the darkness and the wind to the nearest neighbor half a mile away. 2 of the children suffered frostbite. The youngest boy lost the tip of his left ear to the cold. It turned black and fell off 3 weeks later like a dead leaf. Livestock died across the valley. Cows froze to death, standing in their stalls, their legs locked rigid, their eyes open and glazed with a thin film of ice. Chickens were found as small, hard lumps on their roosts, frozen solid overnight light as stones. Horses that broke free from poorly latched barn doors were discovered days later, half buried in drifts, frozen in the posture of running. A rancher east of the Colby place lost his entire herd of 30 cattle. They had drifted against a fence line during a whiteout, piled up on top of each other, and suffocated under the weight of their own bodies and the accumulating snow. Children coughed through the nights, deep, wet, hacking coughs that echoed in the cold, drafty cabins and kept everyone awake and reminded parents of the diseases they could not treat and the doctors they could not reach. Women stuffed rags along baseboards and windowsills each evening and found them frozen stiff by morning, hard as boards, useless as armor made of paper. People began burning their possessions. Fence posts pried from frozen ground with crowbars. Old chairs broken apart with axes, table legs, wagon spokes, broken tool handles, barrel staves. Anything that was made of wood and was not structurally essential to the house itself went into the stove. They were burning their future to survive their present, and every one of them knew it, and none of them could stop. And then people started noticing the Harlan place. Otto Brandt saw it first. A practical, taciturn German immigrant who farmed the quarter section east of Maggie's property. Brandt was riding his fence line in mid-December, checking on his cattle in the brutal wind. It was a miserable, necessary task. Cattle caught against fences in blizzard conditions could pile up and die by the dozens. He rode hunched low in the saddle, his face wrapped in a wool scarf that had frozen to the shape of his jaw. His eyes narrowed to slits against the wind-driven snow. He passed Maggie's cabin and glanced at the chimney. The smoke was thin, pale, almost lazy, a light wisp curling upward from the stovepipe and dissolving into the gray sky as if it had nowhere in particular to go. Not the thick, desperate, dark column of smoke that every other chimney in the valley was producing. Not the heavy black exhaust of a stove being fed to its absolute capacity. This was the kind of smoke you might see on a mild October afternoon when someone has lit a small fire just to take the edge off the evening chill. Brandt did not stop. He had cattle to check and a fence to ride and no time for curiosity. But he filed the image in the back of his mind the way a man files a detail that does not quite fit the pattern. He remembered. Several days later, Elias Thorne passed the Harlan cabin on an emergency firewood delivery. A family further down the track was completely out of fuel, and he was hauling a quarter cord from his own dwindling supply to keep them alive. As his wagon creaked past Maggie's property, he saw her. She was outside, near the barn entrance, scattering grain for her chickens who were pecking and scratching in the small, sheltered area by the barn wall, apparently healthy and content and utterly indifferent to the fact that the air temperature was 26 degrees below zero. Maggie was wearing a thick wool shawl over her dress. Nothing else. No heavy coat, no hat, no thick gloves. She moved without urgency, without the hunched, clenched, shivering posture that had become the universal body language of every human being in the territory. She moved the way a person moves when the cold is not a factor, when the cold is somewhere else. She looked up and saw Thorne on his wagon. She gave a simple nod of acknowledgement. Then she turned back to her chickens. Thorne drove on, but the image embedded itself in his consciousness like a splinter. A woman in a dress and a shawl feeding chickens in 26 below calm as springtime. He did not understand it. And Elias Thorne was a man who needed to understand. The mail carrier reported that the windows of the Harlan cabin were not coated with the thick layer of interior frost that decorated every other window in the valley. A rider on the main track saw young Will playing in the snow near the cabin door, properly dressed for cold, but not displaying any of the desperate distress that characterized every other child he had encountered that month. Small details, isolated observations. No one gathered them. No one assembled them into a pattern. Everyone was too busy fighting their own battles, too consumed by the hour-to-hour struggle of keeping fires alive and children warm and livestock breathing to stop and wonder about the strange tranquility of the widow Harlan's homestead. But the details were there, accumulating silently like evidence at a trial no one knew was being conducted. Inside the cabin, Maggie Harlan was living in a different winter. She had walked the tunnel for the first time in true cold on the morning of December 9th, when the temperature dropped below zero and stayed there. She opened the insulated door from the cabin mudroom and stepped down into the passage and felt the change immediately. Completely. Totally. The wind stopped. Not gradually, not partially. It stopped as if she had stepped through a wall into another world. The air in the tunnel was perfectly still, not a whisper of movement. And it was warm. Not warm the way a room heated by a stove is warm, that dry, uneven directional heat that fades with distance from the source. This was different. This warmth came from everywhere at once, from the earth walls, from the packed earth floor beneath the gravel, from the earth above her head. It was a deep, patient, enveloping warmth, the warmth of something that did not need fuel, did not need tending, did not need attention. It simply was. She walked 60 feet to the barn. She could hear the cows breathing before she reached the second door. She milked, she fed, she checked the water, she walked back. 20 minutes, no coat, no exposure, no heat loss from the cabin. She could have done it in her nightgown. Every other woman in the valley made that same trip cabin to barn and back 2 or 3 times a day. Every trip required bundling into heavy coats, scarves, hats, gloves. Every trip meant opening the cabin door and admitting a blast of Arctic air that would take 30 minutes and a quarter pound of wood to overcome. Every trip meant exposing hands and face to wind that could freeze skin in under 2 minutes. In a blizzard, that 60-foot walk could become a fatal journey. Women had been found frozen to death between their houses and their barns, disoriented by whiteout, unable to find a door that was 10 feet away. Children could not make the trip at all during storms. Even for a grown man, it was a calculated risk every single time. Maggie had eliminated that risk entirely. She walked to her barn the way she walked to her kitchen, in house clothes, in warmth, in safety. The tunnel was not merely a convenience, it was the elimination of the single most dangerous daily task on a Northern Plains homestead. And there was something else, something harder to measure but equally important, the human dignity of it. In every other cabin in the valley, winter was an exercise in endurance. People lived in their coats. They slept in their boots. They huddled near the stove and abandoned the rest of their homes to the cold. Children did their lessons wearing mittens. Women cooked wearing scarves. Men came inside with frost in their beards and stood over the stove like refugees warming themselves at a fire in a field. There was no comfort. There was no normalcy. There was only the relentless grinding hour-by-hour fight to stay alive. In Maggie's cabin, the children did their lessons at the table in cotton shirts. Maggie cooked in her apron. She mended clothes with bare hands. She read by lamplight without shivering. They slept through the night without waking to stoke a dying fire. The system did not just keep them warm, it gave them back their lives. It turned winter from something to survive into something to live through. There is a difference, and the difference matters more than any thermometer reading. She kept a journal. Every day, in small, precise handwriting on wrapping paper, she recorded the data. Outside temperature, tunnel temperature, cabin temperature, amount of wood burned, wind speed and direction when she could estimate it, notes on condensation, on drainage, on the performance of the ventilation intake at the barn end. The numbers told the story more clearly than any words could. December 12th, outside temperature -31, tunnel temperature 48 degrees, cabin temperature 60 degrees. Wood consumed 3 sticks. Wind northwest estimated 25 miles per hour. Notes, no drafts, floor warm, children comfortable. December 18th, outside -38, wind 30 miles per hour, tunnel 47, cabin 59. Wood consumed 4 sticks. Notes, heavy wind and all night. No effect inside. We recorded temperatures this morning without being asked. 3 sticks, 4 sticks per day. While families across the valley fed their stoves 3 or 4 sticks per hour and still watched their children's breath fog in the air. In the second week of December, a problem appeared that seized Maggie by the throat and would not let go. She found moisture on the tunnel walls near the cabin end. Small droplets shining in the lamplight like tiny beads of glass. Condensation. Warm, moist air from the barn meeting the cooler earth near the cabin created moisture on the tunnel surfaces. It was a natural, predictable physical phenomenon. But the sight of it brought Elias Thorne's words back to her like a slap across the face. Mud trap, cistern, fill like a bucket. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the darkness and listened. From somewhere below her, from the tunnel beneath the cabin floor, she could hear a faint dripping. Rhythmic, steady, soft as a whisper, and relentless as a heartbeat. It sounded like a countdown. She was in the tunnel before dawn, on her hands and knees, the lamp casting long, wavering shadows on the timber frame above her. She examined every inch of the walls and floor with the intensity of a woman who knows that the next thing she finds will either save her or destroy her. The condensation was real. The dripping was real, and the drainage system she had built was handling both of them exactly as designed. The water ran down the earth walls collected on the gravel bed, followed the slight, imperceptible grade she had built into the floor, and flowed steadily, gently, inevitably toward the lower barn foundation, where it soaked into the gravel and dispersed into the surrounding earth. No pooling, no standing water, no saturation of the cabin foundation. The system worked. But the fear had been real. She sat on the tunnel floor with her back against the earth wall and the lamp beside her, and she admitted it to herself. She was not an engineer. She was the wife of an engineer. She was a woman who had listened carefully and remembered clearly and built bravely, but she did not have Jim's training. She did not have his mathematical certainty. She was operating on memory and instinct and desperation, and if any one of those proved unreliable, she would lose everything. Then she looked at the gravel. The water was flowing in the right direction, at the right rate. The gravel did not lie. The grade did not lie. Physics did not lie. She did not need to be an engineer. She needed to be correct. And the evidence under her hands said she was correct. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her skirt, climbed back up to the cabin, made breakfast. Christmas came. She made a small dinner from canned vegetables and salt pork and the last of the flour she had been saving for a special occasion. She gave Will a carved wooden horse that Jim had made the previous winter and hidden in the barn, a gift intended for the boy's birthday that Jim had not lived to give. She gave Clara a rag doll she had sewn from scraps during the long November evenings when the children were asleep, and the only sound was the wind in the stove and the scratch of her needle through cloth. They ate together at the table in the warm cabin, the stove murmuring its low, steady murmur, the lamplight golden on their faces. After supper, Will asked if he could read from the book of frontier stories that Jim used to read aloud. Maggie said yes. Will read slowly, carefully, stumbling over the longer words, his voice rising and falling in the cadences of a child who is learning that words have weight. Clara fell asleep with her head on the table, her cheek pressed against the warm wood, one hand still holding a piece of cornbread. Maggie sat and listened to her son read his father's favorite stories and did not trust herself to speak. The cabin was warmer than it had ever been on Christmas, and it was the loneliest night of her life. The days shortened to their minimum and began to lengthen again, and the cold only deepened. Late December brought a new dimension to Maggie's endurance: the isolation. 2 months of winter alone, with 2 small children, no adult conversation, no visitors, no human contact beyond the weekly trip to the trading post that the weather increasingly made impossible. The valley believed she was insane. The grave house, the crazy widow, the woman building her own tomb. One night, with the children long asleep and the cabin quiet and warm, and impossibly lonely, Maggie sat at Jim's table and opened his notebook. She turned to the last page. Check Section C supports. Told foreman, not safe. The last words of a man who had seen the danger clearly, reported it accurately, been ignored completely, and died because of it. She closed the notebook, placed her hand flat on the leather cover. The leather was smooth and warm from the cabin air, and under her hand it felt almost alive, almost like skin. She wiped her eyes once with the back of her hand, one quick motion. Then she drew one long breath, held it, and let it go. She straightened her shoulders. That was all the breaking down she allowed herself. One gesture, one breath, then upright again. Then Claire was there, standing in the doorway in her nightgown, barefoot on the warm floor. Not the sheet of ice that the floor had been last winter. Warm wood, warm earth beneath. The girl padded across the room and climbed onto the chair beside her mother and leaned her small, warm body against Maggie's arm. "Mama, our house is so warm." 3 words, murmured in the half-sleep of a 5-year-old who had no understanding of what those words cost or what they meant. Then her eyes closed and her breathing deepened, and she was asleep against her mother's shoulder, heavy and trusting and utterly safe. Maggie sat in the warm cabin with her sleeping daughter against her arm and the dead man's notebook under her hand, and she thought, this is enough. This is what I was building for. Not for Elias Thorne, not for Calvin Jessup, not for the women at the church who whisper about me or the men at the trading post who laugh. For this, for the floor to be warm under her bare feet, for the house to be warm around her sleeping body. This is enough. The first week of January brought Rob Harlan to the door. Not the Rob who had warned her and threatened her and told her it had gone too far. A different Rob, a diminished one, a man who had run out of everything except the knowledge of where warmth could be found. Dorothy was sick, a deep chest cold that had settled into her lungs and would not break. Their 2 children coughed through every night. The firewood supply was running dangerously low. Rob stood on the doorstep with frost on his eyebrows and his hat in his hands, and the last remnants of his pride dissolving in the warm air that flowed out through the open door. "Maggie, Dot is sick. The children too. I need—" He could not finish the sentence. The man who had warned her about the county. The man who had stood in this same yard and told her that people thought she was incompetent. That man could not bring himself to say the word help. Maggie opened the door wide. "Come in, Rob." He stepped inside and stopped. The warmth took hold of him, and he stood in it motionless, his face undergoing a sequence of expressions that moved from shock through confusion, through something that looked very much like shame. He stared at the children doing their lessons at the table, at the stove burning low and easy, at the dry, comfortable walls, at the thermometer reading 61 degrees while the world outside his frozen coat was trying to kill everyone he loved. Maggie poured him coffee. She asked about Dorothy's condition. The words she did not say were louder than the words she did say. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say, "I warned you." She did not say, "Where was the county when I needed help?" She poured coffee and asked about his wife and his children, and the simple human decency of that response cut Rob deeper than any accusation could have. He brought Dorothy and the children the next day. Maggie gave them her bed. She and Will and Clara slept on the floor, on the warm floor. The floor that was not ice, the floor that was proof of everything she had built and everything the valley had refused to believe. Dorothy's fever broke after 3 days. The children stopped coughing after 5. Color returned to their faces. They ate without shivering. They slept without waking. They played with Will and Clara in the warm cabin, and the sound of children laughing filled the house for the first time since Jim died. Rob watched everything. He watched Maggie walk into the tunnel in her house dress and return 20 minutes later with a pail of warm milk. He watched the stove burn small and patient and sufficient. He watched his brother's children do arithmetic in cotton shirts, while his own children, still recovering, had spent the past months sleeping in every coat and blanket they owned. He did not ask Maggie to explain the physics. He did not need to understand how it worked. He needed to understand that it did work. And the evidence was everywhere he looked, in the thermometer on the wall, in the faces of the children, in the quiet, steady warmth that filled every corner of the room equally, without hot spots, without cold pockets, without the desperate, uneven heat of a stove fighting a losing battle. Every morning before Maggie woke, Rob went outside to the woodpile and split kindling. He stacked it neatly by the cabin door. He never explained why. He never apologized in words. He split wood. In the language of a man who does not know how to say he is sorry, a man who was raised to believe that words of contrition are a weakness, he split wood every morning in the dark, in the cold. And he stacked it by the door, and that was his apology, and it was enough. And then the blizzard came. January 12th, 1888, the day the sky fell. It began with a lie, a sudden, unexpected warming. Temperatures rose to nearly freezing. The wind dropped. The sun appeared for the first time in weeks, pale and watery, but real. The world exhaled. People opened their doors. Children were sent to school. Ranchers saddled horses and rode out to check distant herds. The territory allowed itself a few hours of hope. The hope was a trap. The cold front hit in the early afternoon. It came from the northwest, a wall of Arctic air so dense and so fast-moving that it seemed to have weight, seemed to have mass, seemed to be a physical object slamming into the landscape rather than a change in weather. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 3 hours. The wind, which had been calm all morning, exploded from 0 to 50 miles per hour in what felt like an instant. Snow materialized from everywhere at once, not falling from the sky, but driven horizontally, vertically, diagonally, whipped into blinding vortexes that reduced visibility to absolute zero. They called it the school children's blizzard because it caught children walking home from school. Across the Dakota Territory and the Nebraska Territory, 235 people died. Many of them were children. Children who left the schoolhouse door at 3 in the afternoon under clear skies and were dead by 4, lost in a whiteout between 2 buildings they could have reached in 90 seconds on any normal day. A distance of 100 yards became a fatal journey when you could not see your own hand in front of your face, when you could not tell north from south or up from down, when the wind drove the breath back into your lungs and the snow packed into your nose and mouth and eyes until you could not breathe and could not see and could not think, and all you could do was keep walking and hope that the next step would bring you to a wall or a door or any solid thing that was not the white howling killing, nothing that had swallowed the world. In the valley, every family barricaded their doors and held on. The wind tore shingles from roofs. Timbers groaned under the weight of snow. Livestock that had been let out to graze during the morning's false thaw were caught in the open and died where they stood. The temperature with wind chill plunged past 80 degrees below zero. And Elias Thorne loaded half a cord of his best seasoned oak onto a sleigh, harnessed his two strongest horses, and drove into the mouth of the storm. He was not a reckless man. He was not a fool. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life building shelter for other people, and he understood in his bones that the shelters he had built were failing tonight. The weakest would fail first. The families with the least would. The families in the smallest cabins. The families most alone. The widow Harlan was at the top of his list. 2 children, no husband, the grave house. He was certain she was in the worst danger of anyone in the valley. His wife had tried to stop him. She had stood in the doorway of their own cold house wrapped in blankets, her face white with fear, and told him he would die out there. He had looked at her and said, "If I do not go, they will die in there." He kissed her forehead. He walked out. He did not look back because looking back would have given him a reason to stay, and he could not afford a reason to stay. Not tonight. He fought the sleigh through drifts that buried the runners. The horses, 2 big draft animals with the hearts of lions and the patience of stone, labored through snow that reached their chests. Their flanks steamed, their nostrils flared red against the white. Their breath froze in thick clouds that the wind tore away before they could form. Thorne could barely see the animals in front of him. He could not see the road. He could not see the sky or the ground or the horizon. The world was a single howling white void in every direction, and the only things in it that were real were the reins in his frozen hands, and the sound of the horses breathing, and the knowledge that somewhere ahead in the darkness, in the wind and the cold, a woman and 2 children were waiting to be saved. He navigated by memory and by instinct, and by the occasional fence post that materialized from the whiteout and vanished again like a ghost. He counted the posts. He knew how many there were between his property and the Harlan place. He had ridden this track 1,000 times in good weather. Now he rode it blind, counting wooden markers in a white darkness, trusting 20 years of familiarity to guide him through a night that was trying to erase everything familiar from the face of the earth. He found Maggie's door by nearly colliding with it. He hammered on the wood with both fists, his gloves frozen to the shape of his clenched hands, shouting over the storm's roar. The door opened, and for the second time in this story, but for the first time in Elias Thorne's life, the warmth of Margaret Harlan's cabin reached out through the open door and wrapped itself around him like a pair of arms pulling him from deep water. Elias Thorne stood in the doorway and dripped. The ice in his beard melted and fell in small clicks against the wooden floor. His heavy canvas coat, rigid as plate armor, for the past hour began to soften and sag on his shoulders as the warmth penetrated the frozen fabric layer by layer. The ice crusting his eyelashes loosened and ran down his cheeks like tears. His hands clenched inside his gloves in a grip he could not release, slowly uncurled as the blood began moving through his fingers again. The warmth did not rush at him. It arrived steadily, patiently, pressing into his frozen body the way spring presses into the frozen ground. First the surface, then the depth. It came from everywhere at once, from the floor, from the walls, from the still, comfortable air that filled the room with the gentle certainty of something that had been warm for a long time and intended to stay that way. Margaret Harlan stood before him in her wool dress and apron. Her face was calm. Her hands were dusted with flour. Behind her, the cabin was quiet, with the ordinary quiet of a house where nothing extraordinary was happening, where children were doing their lessons and a stove was burning low and the world outside did not exist. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "you should not be out in this." Behind her, Will sat at the table with his slate, working through a column of addition problems. Clara sat beside him, drawing something with chalk, her tongue pressed against her upper lip in concentration. They were wearing cotton shirts. Their faces were pink. Their hands moved freely with the nimble ease of fingers that are warm and dry and comfortable. The stove in the corner glowed with a small, patient fire. Amber, steady, the kind of fire you build when you are not afraid. Thorne could not speak for a moment. He stood in the doorway and stared at the room and tried to reconcile it with the world he had just come from. It would not reconcile. The world he had come from was killing people. This room was the precise opposite of that. This room was life. "Is everything all right?" he managed at last, and the words sounded absurd the moment they left his mouth. "We are fine, Elias," Maggie said. She used his first name. In 3 years of acquaintance, she had never done that. The familiarity was not presumptuous. It was an offering, an acknowledgement that something had changed between them, or was about to. "Come in out of the wind," she said. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him. The storm vanished. The sound of the wind, which had been the dominant fact of his existence for hours, simply ceased as if someone had sealed it behind a wall of glass. The silence was as physical as the warmth. He could feel it pressing against his eardrums, the sudden absence of noise, the impossible quiet of a warm room at the center of a storm that was tearing the world apart. "I brought wood," he said, gesturing vaguely behind him. His voice sounded strange in the quiet. Too loud, too rough. "I was worried about your fire." "The fire is fine," Maggie said. "It is very small. We are burning less than a cord every 3 weeks." Thorne heard the words. He processed them slowly the way a man processes a sentence in a language he is still learning. A cord every 3 weeks. He was burning nearly a cord every week. His neighbors were burning half a cord a week. The Colby Ranch was burning 2 cords a month, and every single one of them was cold. "A cord every 3 weeks," he repeated. "Maggie people are burning half a cord a week, and they are still freezing." His eyes moved around the room, searching for the explanation. The hidden stove, the concealed heat source, the trick, the gimmick, the secret that would make this make sense within the framework of everything he already knew about buildings and heat in winter. He found nothing. One stove, one small fire, one room, 2 children in cotton shirts, flour on the counter, and a pot of something simmering on the stove, and the smell of bread and warmth and ordinary living. He walked to the wall thermometer. He had installed that instrument himself years ago, the same instrument he had installed in every house he had ever built because Elias Thorne believed in measurement, in the honest testimony of mercury and glass, in numbers that could not be argued with or interpreted or explained away. He leaned close. The glass was fogged with condensation from the temperature difference between his frozen body and the warm air. He rubbed it clear with his thumb and waited for the mercury to settle. It did not need long. It was already settled. It had been settled all winter. 62 degrees. He read it again. The mercury was clear. The glass was clean. The number was not ambiguous. 62 degrees Fahrenheit inside this cabin. While outside this cabin, the temperature was 40 below zero, and the wind was driving the effective temperature past 80 below. The difference between the inside of this room and the outside of this room was 102 degrees. And the fire responsible for maintaining that difference was burning the way you burn a fire in October. The data arranged itself in his mind with the terrible surgical precision of a man who understands construction and who understands therefore exactly what these numbers mean and exactly how impossible they should be. The Colby Ranch, 2 cords per month, 42 degrees. The Williams family, 1.8 cords per month, 48 degrees. His own house, his masterwork, 2.5 cords per month, 55 degrees in the main room, 38 in the kitchen, below freezing in the bedrooms. And here, 3/4 of a cord per month, 62 degrees, the entire cabin, uniform, steady, warm. The difference was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of kind. It was not 10% better or 50% better. It was a fundamentally different category of result. This was not a better version of what everyone else was doing. This was something else entirely. Thorne reached out and touched the interior wall with his bare hand. It was cool, but not cold. Not weeping with condensation. Not rimed with frost. Just cool the way a cellar wall feels in summer. He looked at the floor, dry, warm under his boots. He looked at the ceiling corners where frost always accumulated in even the best-built cabins. No frost, no ice crystals, nothing. And then the understanding came. Not gradually, not in pieces. It came all at once like a structure collapsing, like the sudden, clear view that appears when a wall falls and you can see what was behind it all along. The stove was not heating this cabin. The stove was finishing a job that the earth had already mostly done. The tunnel, that 60-foot trench, that ditch, he had mocked that ugly gash in the ground that the valley had called a grave, was pulling air from the barn, air warmed by the body heat of the livestock, and drawing it through 60 feet of underground passage surrounded by earth that maintained a steady 45 to 50 degrees regardless of the apocalypse overhead. By the time that air reached the cabin through the insulated door, it was already close to 50 degrees. The stove only had to raise the temperature 12 degrees. From 50 to 62, not 100 degrees, not 80, 12. The energy savings were not incremental. They were transformational. She had not built a better mousetrap. She had eliminated the need for the trap entirely. She had not improved the cabin. She had changed the equation. She had removed the wind from the calculation by going under it. She had removed the temperature differential by using the earth as a buffer. She had made the cold irrelevant by refusing to fight it on its terms and instead connecting her home to the one heat source that never failed, never wavered, never ran out, and never cost a cent. The earth. And he, the expert, this authority, the master builder of the valley, had spent 20 years perfecting the box. The walls, the joints, the roof, the chimney. He had made the best boxes on the northern plains. And he had never, not once, in 20 years, thought about what was under the box. He had never considered that the ground itself was not an obstacle to be elevated above, but a resource to be connected to. He had been standing on the answer his entire career, and he had never looked down. She had. A woman who had never driven a nail professionally. A woman who had never read a building manual. A woman whose entire engineering education consisted of listening to her husband talk about mines over supper. She had seen what he could not see because he knew too much. His expertise had become a wall around his thinking. He knew the right way so thoroughly that the right way was the only way he could conceive. And Maggie Harlan, who did not know the right way, was free to find a better one. He stood in the middle of the room for a long time. He was not a man given to displays of emotion. His reputation was built on competence and composure and the quiet authority of a man who always knew what to do. That reputation was dissolving in the 62-degree air of a widow's cabin, and he could feel it dissolving, and he did not fight it. He let it go. It was the right thing to do, and Elias Thorne had always eventually done the right thing. He walked to the door, put his hand on the latch, turned back. "Maggie," he said. His voice was low and rough and carried a weight it had not carried an hour ago. "We have been doing this wrong for 50 years. We have been fighting the winter." He paused, looked at the room, the children at their table, the small, steady fire, the thermometer that read 62, while the world ended outside. "You have been using it," he said. He left the firewood stacked beside her door. Half a cord of the best seasoned oak he owned, given freely to a woman who did not need it by a man who finally understood how much he had not known. A gift, an apology, a tribute. All three stacked neatly by the door offered without further words because the words had already been said and nothing more was needed. He drove the sleigh back into the storm. The wind hit him like a fist, and the cold seized his body, and the world turned white and formless around him. But Elias Thorne was not the same man who had driven out 2 hours earlier. That man had been carrying firewood to save a fool. This man was carrying something heavier and more valuable. A new understanding, a rearrangement of everything he thought he knew. A revelation delivered not by a professor or a book or a government bulletin, but by a 34-year-old widow with flour on her hands and a thermometer on her wall. Maggie closed the door. The warmth held. The quiet held. Will looked up from his slate. "Mama," he was really surprised, was he not? Maggie looked at her son. A smile crossed her face. It was small. It was brief. It was the first real smile the boy had seen from his mother in months, and he recognized it the way you recognize the first bird call after a long winter. Not because it was loud, but because it was different from everything that had come before. "Yes," she said, "he was." "Were you surprised, Mama?" Maggie thought about the question. She thought about the months of digging and the weeks of mockery and the long nights of fear and the journal entries and the condensation on the tunnel walls and the gravel that did not lie and the earth that did not fail. "No," she said, "I am just grateful." She looked at Jim's notebook on the shelf, the leather cover, the careful block letters, the last line on the last page. "Check Section C supports, not safe." "Your father would be grateful too," she said, so quietly that she was not certain the words had left her mouth. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, 62 degrees. The blizzard broke on January 14th, 2 days after it began. It did not end the way it started. There was no sudden clearing, no dramatic parting of clouds. It simply exhausted itself, the wind dropping from 50 to 30 to 15 to 5, the snow thinning from a wall to a curtain to a veil to nothing. The sky remained gray and heavy, but the fury was gone. The valley emerged from its houses the way survivors emerge from wreckage. Slowly, blinking, unsure of what they would find. What they found was devastation. Hundreds of head of cattle dead across the territory. Barns collapsed under snow weight. Fences obliterated. The Miller cabin abandoned since the chimney fire had been buried to the roofline. Two elderly homesteaders on isolated claims east of the trading post were found dead in their beds, frozen under stacks of blankets that had not been enough. Frostbite cases that would result in the amputation of fingers and toes. Children with pneumonia. Families completely out of fuel surviving by huddling together in single rooms, burning the last of their furniture, waiting for help that might or might not come. And the story from the Harlan cabin began to move through the valley. Elias Thorne carried it. He did not tell it as gossip or as an anecdote or as a curiosity. He told it as a confession. He told it to every man he met, looking them in the eye, his voice flat and factual, stripping away any pretense of pride or expertise. I went to the Harlan place. I expected to find them freezing. The cabin was 62 degrees. The children were doing lessons in cotton shirts. She is burning less than a quart a month. I have been building houses for 20 years, and I did not understand what I was seeing. Then he would pause, and he would say the thing that made every man who heard it go quiet. I was wrong. We have all been wrong. She solved it. And we laughed at her. That last sentence, we laughed at her. Coming from Elias Thorne, the most respected builder in the county, those words carried the force of a judge reversing his own verdict. When Thorne said he was wrong, men stopped chewing their tobacco and put down their coffee cups and listened, because Elias Thorne being wrong about construction was like the sun being wrong about which direction to rise. The first reaction was disbelief. The thermometer must be faulty. She must have a hidden stockpile of wood. There must be a trick, some technique she was hiding, some advantage she was not revealing. But Thorne was not a man who was easily deceived about heat in construction, and he was not a man who traded in exaggeration. His word was reliable. His word had always been reliable. And his word now was that the widow Harlan had solved a problem that every experienced man in the territory had failed to solve, and she had done it with a ditch some surplus army tin and the memory of her dead husband's voice talking about mines. 1 week after the blizzard, Calvin Jessup returned, true to the word he had given the previous autumn. He brought his instruments. A mercury thermometer certified accurate by the Territorial Bureau of Standards, a measuring tape, a spirit level, a leather-bound notebook, and a steel nib pen. The full apparatus of a man who believes that truth lives in data and that data does not lie. He measured the temperature inside the cabin. 61 degrees. He measured the temperature at the midpoint of the tunnel. 49 degrees. At the barn end of the tunnel, 52. Outside, 22 below zero. He documented the fuel consumption. He calculated the BTU output of the wood burned against the BTU requirement for a cabin of that size at that exterior temperature with those wind conditions. The numbers did not add up. They could not add up unless there was another source of heat. And there was. 60 feet of earth at 45 to 50 degrees and 2 cows and a mule breathing warm air into a ventilation system that delivered it preconditioned and free of charge directly into the cabin's living space. He walked the tunnel, all 60 feet. He ran his hands along the earth walls. He examined the timber framing for rot or structural failure. He checked the corrugated iron for corrosion. He inspected the gravel drainage bed. He placed his spirit level on the tunnel floor and confirmed the grade, that nearly invisible slope, and nodded slowly when the bubble drifted to exactly where it should be. He sniffed the air. Clean, faintly warm, faintly animal. No mold, no rot, no stagnation. He had arrived as a representative of established knowledge. He was leaving as a student. Then Maggie showed him the journal. She handed him the sheaf of wrapping paper, dozens of pages covered in her small, precise pencil markings. Daily entries going back to early December. Date, outside temperature, tunnel temperature, cabin temperature, wood consumed, wind conditions, notes on condensation, notes on drainage performance, notes on the baffled intake pipe and its effect on airflow. Jessup sat at Maggie's kitchen table and turned the pages one by one slowly, his face changing as he read. The professional mask, the bureaucratic composure fell away page by page, replaced by something raw and genuine and very close to awe. This was not luck. This was not folk wisdom. This was not the blind good fortune of a desperate woman who happened to stumble onto something that worked. This was data. Systematic, consistent, rigorously recorded data. This woman, this flower-dusted widow in her apron, had conducted a controlled experiment with a level of documentation that would have satisfied the most demanding professor of natural philosophy in any university in the country. Mrs. Harlan, he has said, And his voice was different now, entirely different from the voice that had lectured her about government pamphlets 4 months ago. It was stripped of condescension. It was stripped of authority. What remained was respect. "May I copy these records?" "You may keep them," Maggie said. "I have them memorized." Jessup brought Doc Hennessy the following week. Hennessy was the Valley's only physician, a practical, no-nonsense man in his 50s, who had spent the winter treating frostbite pneumonia and the slow grinding consequences of chronic cold on human bodies. He had seen more suffering in the past 3 months than in the previous 5 years combined. Jessup asked him to examine the Harlan children as part of the official record. Hennessy examined Will and Clara with the thoroughness of a man looking for harm and finding none. He listened to their lungs. Clear. He checked their skin. Healthy, no cracking from chronic exposure to dry, cold air. He weighed them. Normal. He examined their eyes, their ears, their throats. Everything was fine. Better than fine. He examined children from 3 other families for comparison. Everyone showed signs of prolonged cold stress. Cracked, bleeding skin on hands and faces. Persistent coughs. Weight loss from the reduced appetite that accompanies chronic cold exposure. Pale, drawn faces. Dark circles under tired eyes. The Harlan children were the healthiest patients he had seen since October. Those 2 children, Hennessy told Jessup as they drove away, are in better condition than any child I have examined this winter. If anyone in this valley is living in unhealthy conditions, it is not them. The transformation of the community was not sudden. It happened the way all genuine transformations happen, slowly, reluctantly, through a process of resistance, followed by acceptance, followed by something approaching reverence. Grady Polk came in February, the man who had stood by the stove in the general store and told Rob Harlan that his sister-in-law was digging her own grave. The man who had given the Harlan place its cruel nickname. That man stood at Maggie's door with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground and his voice stripped of everything except need. "Mrs. Harlan, the ranch is running out of wood. Cattle are dying. I need to know how the mound works." Maggie looked at him. She could have closed the door. She could have repeated his words back to him and watched him flinch. She could have told him to ask the men at the trading post, the ones who had laughed. She could have been cruel and she would have been justified and no one would have blamed her. She opened the door wide. "Come in, Mr. Polk. I will show you." She walked him through the tunnel. She explained the drainage, the ventilation, the role of the livestock heat, the thermal properties of earth below the frost line. She explained it patiently and clearly and without any trace of triumph. Polk listened without interrupting, his hat still in his hands, his head bowed slightly, not in shame exactly, but in the posture of a man receiving instruction that he knows he does not deserve. When they emerged from the barn end and stood in the cold sunlight, Polk put his hat on and looked at the earthen mound from the outside. "I am sorry about what I said, Mrs. Harlan. It was not right." Maggie nodded once, that was all. She did not need his apology, but she accepted it because refusing it would have diminished him more than offering it had cost him, and she was not in the business of diminishing people. Otto Brandt came in April as soon as the ground thawed enough to accept a shovel. Hat in hand, the same posture every man in the valley had begun to adopt when approaching Maggie's door, the posture of a man entering a space that commands respect. "Mrs. Harlan, Mr. Thorne told me what you have built. Will you show me how?" Maggie showed him. She walked him through the system the same way she had walked Polk through it, in the same way she would walk dozens of others through it in the months and years that followed. Patient, precise, generous with knowledge she had earned through labor and fear and loneliness, and could have hoarded as her private advantage. Brandt built a shorter version that summer, 30 feet connecting his kitchen to his milk house. He used fieldstone for the lower walls instead of timber, cheaper and more available. But he followed the core principles exactly. Below the frost line, insulate the top, pre-warm the air, use the earth. The following winter, his family experienced comfort they had never known in 15 years on the plains. His firewood consumption dropped by 60%. That result proved the concept was replicable, not a fluke, not dependent on some unique feature of Maggie's property or some hidden advantage she possessed. The physics worked anywhere. The earth was warm everywhere. The idea spread the way useful ideas spread in communities where survival is not theoretical, not through pamphlets or speeches or government endorsements, though those would come later, but through results. One family built a warm way. Their neighbors watched them through the winter. They saw the thin smoke from the chimney. They felt the warmth when they visited. They asked how it was done. Then they built their own. By summer of 1888, a dozen families in the valley were digging. They called them Harlan passages. Some called them warmways. Each one was different in its details, adapted to the local terrain and the materials at hand. Some were simple trenches. Others were more elaborate, with stone-lined walls and multiple ventilation channels. A rancher east of the Colby place built one that connected his main house, his bunkhouse, and his largest barn in a Y-shaped network of underground passages. The Colby Ranch itself, the wealthiest operation in the valley, hired Elias Thorne to design and build a warmway system that the following winter would heat the main house to 65 degrees on less than a quart of wood per month. Thorne threw himself into the work with the zeal of a convert and the skill of a master. He took Maggie's concept and refined it with 20 years of construction expertise, improving the framing, tightening the joints, designing adjustable ventilation dampers that allowed residents to control the flow of pre-warmed air, engineering better door seals that minimized heat loss at the tunnel entries. He did not compete with her idea. He did not try to claim credit for it. He added his craftsmanship to her vision, and the combination of her insight and his skill produced something neither of them could have achieved alone. One afternoon, while helping Brant install the timber frame in his warmway, Thorne paused with a hammer in his hand and looked at the half-finished structure in the trench. He spoke without turning his head, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, the way men of his generation delivered their most important truths. 20 years I built boxes, he said. I built the best boxes in the valley. But she was the first one to teach me that a house does not end at the wall. It starts at the ground. Brant nodded. Neither man said anything else. They went back to driving nails. Calvin Jessup published his findings through the Territorial Department of Agriculture. The bulletin was titled Geothermal Augmentation for Plains Dwellings, a case study of the Harlan system. It contained his measurements, his calculations, his diagrams, and a clear, accessible explanation of the physics involved. It gave the idea something it had lacked until then: institutional legitimacy, the stamp of official recognition. It was no longer the crazy widow's ditch. It was the Harlan system. It had a name. It had data. It had the endorsement of a government agent with calibrated instruments in a leather-bound notebook. The bulletin spread to neighboring counties, then to Minnesota, then to Montana. Within 5 years, variations of Maggie's design were being used by hundreds of homesteaders across the northern Great Plains. What she had built in the autumn of 1887, using principles remembered from a dead man's conversations about mining, anticipated by nearly a century what modern building science would eventually rediscover and formalize under the names earth-sheltered construction and ground-coupled heat exchange. She had no scientific vocabulary for what she had done. She did not need one. She had something better. She had results. Pastor Willard visited in the spring. The man who had gently suggested that Will and Clara might benefit from a more stable arrangement stood in Maggie's yard and looked at the grass-covered mound and the healthy children playing beside it. "Mrs. Harlan," he said, "I want you to know that in this Sunday sermon I will be speaking about faith, the kind of faith that is expressed with a pickaxe and a shovel, not only with prayer." Maggie nodded. She understood what he was offering, and she accepted it in the spirit it was intended. An apology dressed in the only language a preacher has. Maggie did not change. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. The attention, the validation, the slow reversal from ridicule to respect. None of it altered her daily life. She woke before dawn. She milked the cows. She fed the chickens. She tended the garden. She taught her children. When people came to see the warmway, she showed them. She answered their questions. She did not charge money. She did not ask for credit. She did not stand on ceremony or hold grudges or remind anyone of what they had said when they thought she was crazy. She simply showed them, and then she went back to her work. One evening in late spring, Maggie stepped out onto the porch and found Will sitting on the top step with his slate balanced on his knees. She looked over his shoulder and stopped. He had drawn a cross-section of the tunnel. The earth walls were labeled with his careful 7-year-old printing. Warm ground. An arrow showed the airflow from the barn end with a note beside it: heat from the cows. Another arrow showed the wind above the surface marked with 2 words: cannot enter. The proportions were rough. The lettering was uneven, but the diagram was correct. The principles were accurate. The understanding was real. Maggie looked at her son's drawing. Then she turned and looked through the open cabin door at Jim's notebook on the shelf inside. The leather cover, the precise block letters, the diagrams of ventilation shafts and airflow patterns drawn by a man who understood the earth from the inside out. 2 generations, 2 sets of hands, the same language, the same way of seeing the world, the same understanding that the earth is not an obstacle, but a partner, not an enemy, but an ally, not a dead surface, but a living system with its own rules and its own gifts. She took the notebook down from the shelf. She carried it out to the porch. She placed it beside Will's slate. "This was your father's," she said. "You keep it now." Will opened the notebook. He turned the pages slowly, his eyes widening as he recognized in his father's drawings the same lines and arrows he had just put on his own slate. The same tunnels, the same airflow, the same underground logic. He looked up at his mother, and in his face she saw Jim's face, and in his eyes she saw the spark of a mind that would carry this knowledge forward into the future and build on it in ways she could not yet imagine. He was too young to fully understand the weight of that moment, but she understood. The knowledge had not died in Section C. It had not been buried under the collapsed timbers and the broken rock. It had survived because she had carried it through grief and fear and loneliness and the contempt of men who thought they knew better. She had carried it in her memory the way the earth carries heat, quietly, steadily, without failing. And now it was here in her son's hands, alive and growing and reaching towards something she would not live to see, but that she had made possible. The following years brought changes that Maggie observed without comment. The warmways multiplied across the valley and beyond, each one slightly different in its construction, but identical in its principle. A homesteader in Bonhomme County built one using nothing but fieldstone and sod materials that cost him nothing but labor. A rancher near the Missouri Breaks constructed a network of 3 interconnected passages that heated his main house, his bunkhouse, and his calving barn through a single system. A school teacher in a small town south of Pierre read Jessup's bulletin and persuaded the school board to build a warmway connecting the schoolhouse to the wood storage building. That winter, the children studied in a room that held 58 degrees without a fire. The first schoolhouse in the territory where ink did not freeze in the inkwells. Elias Thorne became the primary architect of the movement, though he never used that word and would have been uncomfortable with the suggestion. He drew up plans. He standardized dimensions. He experimented with different framing techniques and drainage configurations. He figured out that a tunnel with a slight curve, rather than a straight line, created a natural air brake that slowed the flow and increased the heat exchange efficiency. He discovered that lining the bottom 3 feet of the tunnel walls with flat stones created a thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, smoothing the temperature fluctuations even further. But every plan he drew, every improvement he made, he credited to Maggie. He would not allow the idea to be attributed to anyone else. When the territorial newspaper ran a story about the warmway phenomenon and referred to it as the Thorne system, he wrote a letter to the editor that was published the following week. The letter was brief and direct, as Thorne's communications always were. "The system that bears my name in your recent article is not mine. It was designed and built by Mrs. Margaret Harlan of this county in the autumn of 1887. I claim no part of it except the privilege of having learned from it. Any article that attributes this work to me rather than to its inventor is in error, and I request a correction." The correction was printed. The system continued to be known by various names in different regions: Harlan passages, warmways, earth tunnels, ground channels. But in the valley where it was born, there was only one name for it. Everyone knew whose idea it was. Everyone remembered what they had called it before they understood it. And the memory of that error, the memory of their own laughter and their own mockery, served as a permanent reminder that certainty is not the same thing as understanding, and that the loudest voice in the room is not always the one that knows the most. Rob Harlan never fully recovered from the shame of what he had done, or rather what he had failed to do. He had failed to stand with his brother's wife when she needed him. He had failed to trust her judgment when every instinct should have told him she was right. He had let the fear of other men's opinions override his own conscience, and that failure would mark him for the rest of his life. But he made amends the only way he knew how. He became Maggie's most reliable helper. He hauled materials. He dug trenches for neighbors who lacked the strength or the skill. He drove Maggie's wagon to the trading post when the weather was bad. He never spoke about what he had done, and Maggie never mentioned it. The silence between them on that subject was not awkward. It was complete. It was the silence of a debt that had been paid in full, not with words, but with years of steady, quiet, uncomplaining work. Dorothy recovered fully from her illness, became Maggie's closest friend. The two women who had circled each other with wariness and unspoken tension for years found in the aftermath of that terrible winter a bond that neither of them had expected. Dorothy had lain in Maggie's bed, breathing Maggie's air, recovering under Maggie's roof, while her own house, the house her husband had built by the conventional methods, had nearly killed her. That experience dissolved whatever barriers had existed between them. They preserved vegetables together in the fall. They quilted together in the winter. They raised their children side by side in cabins connected to the earth in a valley that had learned the hard way that the ground beneath your feet is not something to fear. Clara grew up quiet and strong with her mother's watchfulness and her mother's way of seeing everything without needing to comment on it. She married a farmer from the next county and raised 4 children of her own. Her house had a warm way. Her children's houses had warm ways. The knowledge traveled through the family line like water through an underground stream, invisible from the surface but always flowing. William Harlan went on to study engineering at the State University. His professors would remark on his intuitive grasp of thermodynamics and earth science, an understanding that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than textbooks, from some place that formal education could not quite reach. He would carry his father's notebook for the rest of his life, not as a sentimental keepsake, but as a working reference. Its pages worn soft from handling its margins, filled with his own additions and calculations and sketches. The first page of his own professional notebook, the one he would fill with his own designs over a career spanning 4 decades, contained a single line written in pencil in his mother's handwriting. The earth has its own heat. Not much, but steady. It never quits. Years later, when Maggie was old and the cabin was weathered and the warm way had been repaired and rebuilt twice over, a visiting journalist from a territorial newspaper made the long drive out to her property. He wanted to write about the woman whose invention had changed the way hundreds of families survived the northern winters. He found her on the porch mending a shirt, her hands still strong and quick, despite the years her face lined with the deep creases of a life lived mostly outdoors. He was a young man, eager and polite, with a notebook and a pencil and the particular energy of someone who believes he is about to capture a great story. He had expected to find a monument, a plaque perhaps, or at least some acknowledgement of what had been accomplished here. Instead, he found an old woman on a weathered porch doing the same thing she had always done, working. He asked her if she was proud of her invention. She shook her head. "This is not new," she said. Her voice was quiet. It had always been quiet, the voice of a woman who had never needed volume to make herself heard. "It is just correct. The earth is not an enemy. It is a blanket if you know how to use it." The journalist wrote that down. He underlined it twice. He would use it as the headline of his article, and it would become the most quoted line from the most widely reprinted story in the territorial newspaper's history. But sitting on that porch, watching the old woman's needle move through cloth with the same steady rhythm she had used to move a pickaxe through clay 40 years earlier, he sensed that the quote was not the real story. The real story was everything she was not telling him. She did not tell him about the nights of fear, or the mornings of doubt, or the moment she found moisture on the tunnel walls and thought everything was lost. She did not tell him about Christmas alone with 2 children, or the sound of Grady Polk's laughter, or the look on Rob Harlan's face when he stood in her doorway and could not say the word help. She did not tell him about the folded piece of wrapping paper, or the last line in Jim's notebook, or the night Clara walked barefoot across the warm floor and said 3 words that held the whole world inside them. She did not tell him these things because they were not his to know. They belonged to her, to Jim, to Will and Clara, to the cabin and the tunnel and the earth that had kept its promise through every storm and every night and every year since that first desperate autumn when a widow with a pickaxe decided to trust the ground beneath her feet more than the opinions of every man in the valley. Some stories are not meant to be told in full. Some stories are meant to be lived and then to be left like tracks in snow for others to follow or to miss, depending on whether they are paying attention. The original Warmway stood for over 70 years. The cabin and the barn are long gone now, reclaimed by the prairie the way the prairie reclaims everything eventually. The timber has rotted, the corrugated iron has rusted to nothing, The gravel has sunk back into the clay. But if you walk the ground where Margaret Harlan's homestead once stood, and if you know what you are looking for, you can still find it. A long, shallow depression in the earth running 60 feet across the grass. A gentle trough, barely visible, the kind of thing you would walk over 100 times and never notice unless someone told you it was there. A scar on the skin of the land. It tells the story of a woman who listened when others talked, who remembered what others forgot, who built what others mocked, and who was right when every expert in the valley was wrong. It tells the story of a man who was big enough to admit what he did not know. It tells the story of a piece of wrapping paper with a sketch on it folded and tucked into a coat pocket by a man who thought it was not practical, rescued and unfolded by a woman who did not have the luxury of dismissing an idea that might save her children's lives. It tells the story of knowledge passed from a father to a mother to a son, not through universities or textbooks or government bulletins, but through the oldest transmission system in human history. One person talking to another, one person listening, one person remembering. The frontier did not reward tradition for its own sake. It did not reward expertise that could not adapt. It did not reward confidence that was not backed by results. It rewarded what worked. And what Margaret Harlan built in the autumn of 1887 with a pickaxe and a shovel and a dead man's notebook and 4 cords of wood and the quiet and shakable certainty that the earth was not her enemy worked. It worked when the experts said it would not. It worked when the neighbors laughed. It worked when the county agent shook his head. It worked when the pastor suggested her children would be better off elsewhere. It worked on the worst night in the history of the Northern Plains when 235 people died and the temperature fell past 80 below. With wind chill in every cabin in the valley was a freezing, desperate, failing fortress against the cold. It worked because the earth is patient, because the earth does not care about opinion or authority or conventional wisdom. The earth cares about physics, and the physics were on Maggie's side. Every winter when the wind cuts across the high plains of Dakota and the temperature drops and the snow flies and the world turns white and cold and hard, that shallow depression in the ground is a few degrees warmer than the frozen soil around it. Not much warmer, just a few degrees, but steady. The earth remembers. This story presents a historically inspired reconstruction of frontier engineering techniques. The characters' names and specific events depicted are fictional, created for narrative purposes. However, the techniques described are based on real historical practices of earth-sheltered building and passive geothermal heating used by various cultures throughout history. The school children's blizzard of January 1888 was a real event in which an estimated 235 people lost their lives across the Dakota and Nebraska territories.